20th, early 21st century and exposed to a standard media depiction of science. Okay? So, in this media portrayal of science, the vast majority of scientists are male. As a result of this, Farah forms a disposition to respond as if individual scientists are likely to be male. Okay? So if she's told she's going to meet a scientist, she assumes it's going to be a man. If she hears about the latest feat of engineering, she assumes that a man's completed it rather than a woman. Okay, so that's Farah. Timothy, in contrast, has been brought up in a society in which efforts have been made to depict a more egalitarian state within science. So, we're imagining a situation in which the media has been controlled in some way, so 50% of scientists are presented to be women and 50% are presented as men. Okay? As a result of this, he forms a disposition to respond as if it's equally likely that a scientist he might encounter will be male or female, and if he hears about the latest feat of engineering, he is equally likely to picture the engineer as a man as a woman. Okay, so imagining in both of these cases, these individuals don't know any scientists personally, so they're really basing their impression on their media depiction. But in both cases, it happens to be that only 13% of jobs in science, technology, engineering and maths related fields are occupied by women, which is actually the case in the UK now according to recent studies. Now, it might seem as if the right way to respond to this is to say that, well, Timothy is going to be disposed to act in an ethical way. So if you were choosing for someone to either be in a position like Farah's or to be in a position like Timothy's, if you were interested in ethical concerns, you would want them to be in a position like Timothy's. Whereas if you wanted someone to have maximal knowledge and understanding about the world, you would want them to be brought up in Farah's society. Because in this society, she's getting an accurate depiction of science and she's forming an accurate set of responses to individual scientists. A number of philosophers have recently argued that this sort of intuitive response is broadly correct, okay? So they've argued that we face an ethical epistemic dilemma when it comes to stereotypes. So where stereotypes reflect some aspect of social reality, so like the stereotype associating science with men, this reflects something of the social reality that there are more men and women in science, vastly more. So when you have stereotypes of this sort that are accurate in some sense, it might not be ethical to apply the stereotype, but it's going to be epistemically beneficial, or at least it could be, okay? So Kelly and Rhoda focus on this example of science and men, and they say that whilst it isn't ethical to apply the stereotype, it might in some sense be rational, okay? They don't say much more than that, but that's the basic idea. I mean, they're actually talking about implicit bias, and they say a bit more. They say that if implicit biases are just associations between particular concepts, so what we have here is an association between science and men, so just an association between concepts, and maybe it's rational to apply the implicit bias and be influenced by it in a particular case, because the association is reflecting the reality. Okay. Tamar Gendler has argued something similar with respect to stereotyping about black men and associating them with crime. Okay. Whilst it seems as if it's unethical to stereotype black men as criminals, actually, she says that to do the opposite, choose not to stereotype black men as criminals, is epistemically costly. It leads to epistemic costs because it involves ignoring certain social realities. Okay. I mean, Gendler's story is a bit more complex than this. So she outlines epistemic costs that are associated with stereotyping and epistemic costs that are associated with choosing not to stereotype. But her ideas have been influential on other authors who responded to her, like Joshua Mugg, who says, actually, the costs that Gendler identifies with stereotyping aren't really costs for the racist. They might be costs for other people, but not for them. I can talk about the particular examples if you like the questions, but so that we get through this, I won't go into the details now. But Mugg is convinced by Gendler's claim that there are costs involved with choosing not to stereotype, but they're epistemic still is to choose not to stereotype. So we have this epistemic ethical dilemma. If we do the thing that's ethical, which is to choose not to stereotype, not to associate black men with crime, then we're going to suffer serious epistemic costs. Not get ethical epistemic gains that Gender says we'll get, but just the costs. Okay, so the main goal of this talk, my talk right now, is to show that it's misleading to characterise us as facing an ethical epistemic dilemma of this sort. I'm going to argue that often, and I think perhaps more often than not, but you can tell me whether I'm wrong about that, ethical and epistemic goals converge. In particular, I'm going to argue it's often better from an epistemic perspective to do what might seem intuitively to be epistemically costly, which is to ignore the social realities, such as the social reality that women are underrepresented in the sciences, or black men are more heavily involved in criminal activities, so a black man is more likely than a white man to engage in criminal behaviour, statistically. Okay, so I'm going to argue that you can have this imperfect cognition, which is this misrepresentation of the social reality, and this can be epistemically beneficial to us. Okay, because of this, the best thing from an epistemic perspective can be to ignore social realities, to prevent ourselves from engaging in stereotyping. This is also going to be the ethical thing to do, so we don't really face an epistemic ethical dilemma. Now, I should qualify this a little bit. So I'm not saying it's always going to be the case that epistemic and ethical goals are going to converge in this way, but I think that it's really interesting to consider cases where they do, and in particular, I think the cases that philosophers have focused on so far, so cases like stereotyping of black men as criminals or scientists as men, these are cases in which the best epistemic situation is going to be achieved by choosing to ignore social realities. Okay, so in order to establish my claim, I'm going to use Lisa and Emma's concept of epistemic innocence. Okay, so you've had an introduction to this, so I don't need to do too much work here. But according to Lisa and Emma, it's worth focusing on certain cognitions which have obvious epistemic costs, but they confer an epistemic benefit on the agent, which no alternative cognition available to the agent at that time can confer onto them. And there's an extra feature of some cognitions that are imperfect in this way, which is that they're a lesser of two evils. So while the cognitions are faulty, they have this imperfect nature, and therefore they bring epistemic costs, they lead to the avoidance of more substantial epistemic costs. And these costs will be associated with the cognitions that lack their faults. Okay, so the idea here with the lesser of two evils is that, okay, you've got this cognition, you could have a delusional belief, or you could have a confabulated explanation. This has some costs, but the epistemic costs are outweighed by the benefits of having that cognition. You couldn't have those benefits with having any other cognition that lacks the faults with that one, so with the deluded belief or the confabulated explanation, so it's a lesser of two evils. Are we clear on that? Because it was quick. Okay, good. Alright, so I'm going to argue that when we fail to reflect social realities, so when we set ourselves up so we're in a situation like that of Timothy's rather than Farah's, what we're doing is setting ourselves up so we have an epistemically innocent cognition. So first of all, I need to show that these cognitions have some epistemic benefits. I need to then show that the same benefits couldn't be achieved through an alternative cognition, and then, so I'm moving beyond the epistemic innocence claim, and I want to say that it can also be the case that if you have a cognition that's faulty like Timothy's, what you have is a cognition that is a lesser of two epistemic evils. So, to establish the first point, that there are epistemic benefits to having these cognitions that misrepresent the social reality, I'm going to draw on the literature from social psychology on stereotyping. Okay, so you might think of stereotyping and then think that stereotyping is necessarily distorted, but this isn't how social psychologists tend to speak now, which is really helpful for me, because I'm focusing on cases where individuals associate certain social groups with characteristics, even where those those associations reflect some aspect of social reality. Okay, so if it were the case that social psychologists were describing stereotypes in such a way that they were always inaccurate, I couldn't appeal to this literature. But as it stands, the definition of stereotypes given within this literature is that they're beliefs about the characteristics, attributes, and behaviours of members of certain groups. Okay, so there's a neutral definition of stereotypes. So the association, for example, between science and men is going to count as a stereotype. So if you look at the stereotyping literature, you find that there have been identified various epistemic costs of stereotyping. Okay? So when I'm describing epistemic costs, I'm thinking of them in terms of either cognitions that lead us to fail to track the truth, or cognitions that lead us to fail to respond to relevant evidence that's available to us. So my idea is that the stereotyping literature is presenting various cases where stereotypes lead us to fail to track the truth or fail to respond to evidence. I'm hoping I've kind of got externus and internus on board there. I mean, I don't think I'll have convinced everyone, but hopefully a large percentage of people. So my idea is that even accurate stereotypes, such as a stereotype associating science with men, leads to the following costs, and they're serious costs. Okay. First of all, stereotypes lead only some of the relevant information that an individual has encountered to be remembered and used in belief and judgment. Okay. So information that's consistent with a stereotype tends to be remembered, whereas information inconsistent with the stereotype tends not to be remembered. An example of this would be if you interact with a woman who you know through her professional career. She displays various characteristics, so she's smart and funny, but she displays a sort of characteristic that might be described as being cold. Okay, the stereotype of a career woman is competent and cold, so it's likely that you're going to remember the fact that she was cold rather than the other features of the woman that she displays. This seems to be epistemically problematic, right? You have various pieces of evidence available to you, you only remember and later use in your judgment a limited amount of that information, and it can lead to distortions of your judgment of this individual. Okay, on top of this, stereotypes can lead to the misinterpretation of ambiguous behavioural evidence. In particular, if you have, so one study undertaken by Burt Duncan showed that participants in an experiment were more likely to judge a shoving action, so an action where one person shoves another, to be an act of aggression when the shove is undertaken by a black person and a white person rather than the other way around. And then the numbers are really substantially different. The percentage of people will say this is an aggressive act when it's committed by a black person in comparison to when it's committed by a white person. It seems as if why you should respond to an ambiguous action is that you should conclude that it's ambiguous. But what people are doing is interpreting it in a way that's fitting the stereotype. Okay, so on top of this, it seems as if people ignore differences between members of certain groups as a result of stereotyping. So how this works is you form a stereotype associating certain individuals within a wider group with certain characteristics. They become grouped off from the rest. They become viewed as a minority group. Once people are viewed as members of a minority group, they are more likely to be assumed to be the same as each other than when they were viewed as a member of a wider group. So an example of this is male nurses. Right? So a study's been undertaken that shows that people's conception of male nurses is that they're really similar to each other, far more similar to each other than female nurses are. Because they've become typed as part of this minority group, individual male nurses are assumed to have characteristics of other male nurses. So if you've encountered one male nurse in your life, you're likely to assume that other male nurses are going to be exactly the same as this male nurse. So you then encounter a new male nurse, you're going to assume that this individual has the characteristics of the other people you've met before, and fail to notice the details about them which are inconsistent with them being similar to the other members of that group. A further sort of related phenomenon is that when people are viewed as different members of different groups, it tends to be the case that people ignore similarities between members of the different groups. Okay, so say you've got the group of male scientists, the group of female scientists. Once you've ended up viewing these individuals as members of different groups, because you've associated them with different traits, you assume that they're different in some significant way, then you're likely to fail to ignore similarities between the different groups. So say that you have this association with male scientists as being committed, then given that, you're now more likely to view female scientists as different to male scientists because you've made this distinction due to stereotyping. You're unlikely to notice when a female scientist displays characteristics that show that she is committed. Okay. A final cost that comes along with stereotyping is that it's often the case that as a result of stereotyping, inappropriate associations are made and associations that would be appropriate are not made. Okay, so on one model of stereotyping, for example, stereotypes are prototypes. So this is only one model of stereotyping, but I think similar things can be said about other models of stereotyping too. I'm focusing on this just to illustrate the point. But if stereotypes are prototypes, then they're abstract representations of typical features of members of a certain group. Okay. So you might have the stereotype, the prototype, of scientists as male, bespectacled, lab coat wearing, innovative, having attentiveness to detail, have these various characteristics. Okay, this might be part of your prototype of a scientist. But it seems as if whether or not this prototype will be applied to an individual, whether the stereotype is applied to them, will be determined by their superficial characteristics. So it could easily be the case that you encounter an individual scientist who is female. You don't apply the prototype of a scientist to that individual because she doesn't display the stereotypical feature that's encoded in this prototype of being male. And so you don't associate all these other characteristics that are associated with science, like attentiveness to detail, to this individual because she doesn't display the superficial characteristic encoded in the prototype. In addition to this, though, if someone does display the superficial characteristic of being male and wearing spectacles, then it might be that you end up applying the stereotype of a scientist or an intellectual to this individual, and then you assume that they have certain characteristics they don't. Okay? Making associations of this sort can lead to a couple of sorts of errors. So it can lead to people making poor inferences. So just assuming that people have traits that they do, or assuming that they don't have traits, assuming that they have traits that they don't, or assuming that they don't have traits that they do. But it can also lead to problems like cognitive depletion. Gendler pointed out that this phenomenon is relevant to philosophers. When people engage in stereotyping, if they on some level notice that stereotype that they're making isn't the sort of thing they want to endorse, often a large amount of their cognitive efforts are taken in suppressing their automatic stereotypical response, and so as a result of this they have problems performing other cognitive tasks. So these are costs of stereotyping, right? As it stands, they're just costs of stereotyping, but I think that it's clear that there can be costs of even accurate stereotyping. So even stereotyping where the stereotype you apply has some accuracy, or even if you had a stereotype that was fully accurate. Okay, so think of the distorted memories case, right? So say that you, so say you're encountering a career woman and you have this interaction with her and you form this impression where you only remember certain features that she displays. But imagine career women really are cold. I mean, we are cold, right? So happens to be the case that career women really are cold. It doesn't suddenly become the case that you're no longer suffering distortion in your memories, or you're not going to have relevant information available to you at a later point. So say, well, statistically it is more likely that an individual black person living in the US will engage in criminal behaviour than a counterpart who is white. Okay? So say that the stereotype associating black people with aggression is somehow founded in reality. I think there are serious problems with that. Elsewhere, I argue that there's good reason for thinking that this stereotype associating black people with crime is highly inaccurate. But if we were to assume that it was accurate, it still wouldn't mean that we weren't misinterpreting ambiguous behaviours. And similarly, so if it's right to notice that male nurses are different from female nurses in certain ways, it doesn't mean that it's right to ignore differences between individual male nurses. It doesn't mean that it's right to fail to notice similarities between male and female nurses. Okay. And even if a stereotype has some aspect of reality, it can lead to inaccurate associations being made. Okay, so let's take the stereotype associating science with men. This could be accurate in some sense, but it can still lead to errors, given that the application of the stereotype is determined by the superficial features of an individual. So if a woman doesn't display those characteristics, she could fail to have all these other characteristics associated with her, like attentiveness to detail, just expertise in science and those sorts of things, as a result of the failure to apply this stereotype, which is actually accurate, because it does reflect some aspect of social reality, which is that women are underrepresented in the sciences. Okay, so here I get to the benefits condition. So the idea is that by failing to reflect social realities in your judgments in the way that Timothy would do, you can get various benefits because you can avoid the costs associated with stereotyping. Okay. And here I'm thinking of benefits in a similar way to what I was thinking of costs. So by choosing to not reflect certain social realities or set up your society such that other people don't do so, you can ensure that people are more likely to respond to evidence about individual people's characteristics, for example. Okay. No alternatives condition. So I think this can be met here because the literature on stereotyping suggests that as soon as you start making an association between a set of individuals who form part of a social group and a trait, these sorts of cognitive errors follow. And as I'm saying, these cognitive errors are also epistemic errors. It seems as if it's an inevitable result of individuals reflecting social realities of this sort, that they'll end up engaging in stereotyping and end up suffering various costs. Now I want to move beyond the epistemic innocence claim though, and say that these cognitions can be the lesser of two evils. Now I think that this is right because of the nature and vast quantity of epistemic errors that follow from stereotyping. Okay. So I think inaccurate cognitions that fail to reflect social reality and in doing so prevent us from engaging in stereotyping can be the lesser of two evils, and I think the following example illustrates it. So imagine that you're a judge working on a criminal case where there's a black suspect. Okay. If you engage in stereotyping, then you're reflecting the social reality, which is that black people are statistically more likely to engage in criminal behaviour. But you're looking at an individual black suspect. You're likely to view any behaviours that could be viewed as aggressive or fitting with the criminal stereotype as really showing that that person is aggressive and likely to be criminal. When you interact with this suspect, you're likely to assume that this suspect has various characteristics of other people you've interacted with. So if you're a judge, you've probably interacted with quite a few black criminals, and you're likely to assume that any suspect that you encounter shares various characteristics with these previously encountered black suspects. Okay, so at the same time, you're unlikely to notice features of the individual that indicate that he shares characteristics with members of the population that you don't associate with crime. Okay, so if there are suspects who've been presented to you in court before, and they've presented themselves in such a way you thought, well, yeah, no, this person seems unlikely to be a criminal, then you're unlikely to notice similar traits in the individual who is a black suspect as a result of you failing to notice similarities between different social groups, members of different social groups. Now, it's not always going to be the case that it's best from the epistemic perspective to avoid making associations between members of social groups and character traits. So if you're asked to assess whether a randomly selected criminal about whom you have no other information is likely to be white or black, then using the statistical information about high rates of black and white crime might seem to be the best thing from an epistemic perspective. But in most cases, this doesn't seem to be what happens. Okay? So in most cases, what we do is we interact with an individual, or we're presented information about an individual, and we're making a judgment about that individual when we're stereotyping. One result of this is that as soon as we engage in stereotyping, information about the individual becomes distorted in the various ways I've just described. And it's as a result of that distortion of that information about the individual, the case-specific information, that stereotyping seems so problematic. Okay? So it seems like most cases aren't going to be ones in which you can unproblematically engage in stereotyping without the distorting effects. Okay, so what should we conclude from this? Well, it seems as if we encounter the epistemic ethical dilemma less frequently than first appearance suggested. So what seemed to be the ethical choice from the beginning, what seemed to be the ethical option, is also often the best choice from an epistemic perspective, and that is to approach the world in such a way that you treat, that you sort of ignore certain social realities. So you're egalitarian, so you judge scientists, or you respond as if scientists are equally likely to be male or female, right? Rather than reflecting the statistical realities when you make judgments about individuals. Right, there's a complication it's worth addressing. I'm sure there are many more, and please tell me, I'm sure you will, what the other complications are. But it does seem as if sometimes understanding, which is an epistemic good, requires some sort of conception of the social realities that are faced by an individual. So, if you want to understand the situation or the plight of a female who's struggling in her career in science, it might be important to understand that women are underrepresented in the sciences, so various concerns she might have or needs she might have might not be being met in science as it's currently structured. In order to understand how more black males end up engaging in criminal behaviour, it might be necessary to understand the social reality, which is that many black men are brought up in underprivileged backgrounds and in situations in which they have pressure on them to engage in criminal activity. Okay, so sometimes it's necessary to understand social realities in order to understand the plight of an individual. These are going to be cases in which ignoring social realities seems to be inappropriate. But this doesn't show that, so this doesn't challenge my argument for two reasons. So, first of all, I'm not claiming that in all cases the best thing from an epistemic perspective is to ignore social realities. Secondly, these examples are quite fitting with the overall claim, which is that epistemic and ethical concerns converge, because in this sort of case it seems as if a proper understanding requires understanding social reality, then principles of fairness probably do too. So it's probably the case that you'll only be fair towards an individual if you properly understand the social realities they face that led them to be in a certain situation. Okay, so it's misleading to claim that there's an ethical epistemic dilemma over stereotyping. Ethical and epistemic demands often converge, so they're both met by the same cognition. And for the sake of this workshop, perhaps most interestingly, quite often ethical and epistemic demands converge by inaccurate or imperfect cognitions. So instead of facing a dilemma, instead we face two practical problems. And they're really serious practical problems, really difficult practical problems, I think, which is identifying conditions under which understanding of statistical realities, social realities, are likely to lead to epistemic and ethical gains, and cases where understanding of social realities and statistical realities are going to lead to epistemic costs, and identifying strategies that mean that we are only reflecting those social and statistical realities in our judgments when they're likely to lead to ethical and epistemic gains. But it's wrong to think that they will only lead to either ethical or epistemic gains. Getting this right can mean that we're in the best epistemic and ethical situation at the same time.